Hello, my name is Lauro Vanderborght. I am co-founder of Digita, and in this webinar, we are going to dive in the world of personal data sharing. You might wonder why personal data sharing needs to be done between organizations. Well, one reason revolves around the concept of data reusage. By allowing someone to use the data you as an organization have stored about that person, you allow that person to experience a better digital journey. Imagine that you could give access to your salary information stored at the government with your bank to get a personalized simulation for your house loan or a pension insurance. Today, this would entail downloading PDFs, sending these via email, and trying to prove the validity of these documents. What if I would tell you that this could be replaced with a click of a button? It is possible. This concept already exists specifically for information that is being stored at your bank, thanks to the PSD2 regulation. It allows consumers to use data stored at a bank and get other insightful services from other organizations. Solid allows this to become reality for all sorts of personal data. Another reason is that this allows organizations to provide more transparency and control about what organizations have stored, and it enables trust in data that is being shared between the different actors. Today, we're going to discuss the different aspects of solid and data sharing in three topics. First, we're going to discuss the results of DAPSI, a European research project led by Digita with Tom Haegemans, head of research at Digita, and Dr. Dirk de Bot, data protection expert. Then we're going to hear from Ruben Verborgh, professor in semantic web and one of the founding fathers of Solid. He will talk with us about the advancement of Solid. Finally, Wouter Janssens, CEO of Digita, will give more insights on Digita and the advancement in our development. Welcome, Tom and Dirk. Glad to have you here today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Yeah, I will tell something about the EU project we'll be working on. It's called EU UI Transfer, and it's because some time ago that we've noticed that data reuse within Solid is different from what we are used to. So first of all, we've noticed that when data is reused, the receiving party, when using Solid, might get continuous access to the original copy of the data. Second, with Solid, it is also possible to ensure the authenticity of the data, even when it is copied. And third, a person could reuse his or her data in many different contexts. So that means that the involved parties might function in different capacity. For example, the data reuse could be between a government and a private organization, or between two private organizations. And because of these observations, we've noticed that it's in general not that simple to apply the current privacy legislation in a straightforward way. So the idea of this research was to use data sharing patterns as a tool to tackle legal considerations in the Solid ecosystem.
Okay, sounds very interesting. And why is this project so important in the context of today?
Well, we've noticed that people want to have a better grip on their data. And this better grip demands increasing levels of transparency and control. And one example of this increased control is more possibilities to reuse their data. So to let people reuse their data in many different ways.
Okay, sounds logical. And can we relate this to other trends and initiatives, for example, SOLID?
Yeah, because Solid is a specification that when implemented provides an infrastructure for transparency and control. And one example is indeed enabling better data reuse.
Okay, and data reuse, we're talking about actually sharing data between organizations, which typically makes me think of a B2B, business to business context. But how does this apply to, for example, a government to business context or even a business to government context?
Well, that's a very good question because that's exactly what the framework is about, and that's exactly what was unclear in the current way of working. Because when data is reused between, for example, a government and a private organization, there are different rules than when data is reused between a government and another government. So that's exactly what there are specific rules for.
Okay. And can we make this a bit more concrete and talk about a specific project? For example, one at the Flemish government. How does Solid help the Flemish government to share data?
Yeah, we applied the framework and also Solid to several use cases within the government. And the use case that we used for this research was also at Flanders, and it was about social contributions for families that have an income that lies below a certain limit. So in Flanders, when you have a family that has an income that lies below a certain limit, they can be eligible for a social contribution. And to be able to actually receive this social contribution, families need to prove that their income lies below that certain threshold. And currently, it's not that simple to prove this. As a person, you have to collect a lot of documents, you have to send them to the relevant authorities, and so on. And if we would have to run this, if we would have this process run via the solid standards, it would be a lot easier for citizens to apply for this social contribution, because then they don't have to take those documents anymore in physical form, but they can just reuse their data from their payslips in a structured form and reuse it to apply for that social contribution.
Okay, it's easy to convince me of the potential of Solid. Maybe it's interesting to talk about the challenges. Dirk, as a data protection expert and a strong contributor to the DOPSI research, can you tell me a bit more about the legal aspect and the legal considerations of sharing data between European companies?
Surely we can. I can do that. I think it's important to stress that in the Solid ecosystem, we tend to approach things from the point of view of the citizen, the consumer, and so on. The focus in Solid is always on the reuse of data. But what we tend to forget when we talk about Solid is that, as the concept reuse already indicates, the data have already been used. And that usage of data, in fact, is nothing else than a form of processing. In other words, the sharing or the exchange of data that is central in Solid is always a form of processing. And if that processing relates to or concerns personal data, then of course the GDPR must be applied. What now is the real challenge? The GDPR is not tailored to the situation as in Solid, where the data subject wants to take control and to determine to what extent his or her data can be exchanged. So where in Solid the focus is on the consumer, on the citizen, in data protection law legislation, the focus is more on the parties that, let's say, are involved in the processing, which are the controllers, in this case, the parties between which the exchange takes place. GDPR, it does not, and that's a bit of a problem. As I said already, it's not tailored, but it does not apply to data sharing as such, but it regulates the processing of personal data. When sharing data, an organization always processes data, and those data are, I think, by definition, to be considered as personal. The first step in processing data is always the collection of data. If you want to do something with data, you have to collect them, whether direct or indirectly. Following that collection, the data is then what they call further processed. And this further processing, that's the next step in the processing process, as I would say, can, amongst others, take the form of data sharing or data exchange. In most cases, the further processing, as the sharing is done for a new or another purpose. And that means that in that case, we have to verify whether that further processing is compatible with the original purpose. That's the purpose for which the data have originally been collected. And there, the GDPR provides for some criteria or factors to evaluate that compatibility. If the further processing is not compatible, then normally data exchange or sharing is not possible unless the further processing is prescribed by law or unless the data subject consents to this further processing. Here, the real challenge is that the consent always needs to be free. There are some requirements that have to be met in order to be free, and that raises some issues in the public sector, where it's generally accepted that the dependency of the citizen on the authority does not allow him or her to freely give his consent. Then the solution could be to exercise his or her right of access, so that once the data have been received from the controller, the data subject can provide his or her data to the controller or the organization that asks for it. But here again, and that's no surprise, there can be some legal issues, notably when the applicable legislation does not allow data to be shared with private organizations or for specific purposes. Let's say that if I try to summarize the situation, it seems that the legal reality can be an obstacle to the data subject to control his or her personal data, in particular in sharing his or her data. And then I think an important remark to close is that this applies to all member states of the European Union, although, and that's important to notice, there can be some minor variations between the countries. That's also the reason why in the research we have mainly focused on the Belgian situation as an example, but the findings of the research are applicable to all European member states.
Okay, so indeed there are challenges, but given, Dirk, you have a very strong background as data protection expert in a lot of larger organizations. And do you see these challenges also occurring there today to make the life of the people in charge more difficult?
I see them, and I see in most cases the problems that arise when one tries to apply that kind of solutions. And I think that what I see in practice, it's especially the reuse of personal data that is originally being processed by public organizations that raises issues, that raises problems. Why? Because in most cases, the applicable legislation is rather strict, does not include the possibility to reuse the data by private organizations, which of course makes it difficult for private organizations to reuse the public personal data. And I take this opportunity just to stress that there is a difference to be made between the public personal data and open data. There is a lot of confusion on that topic, because open data by definition are data that are not related to natural persons, so by definition are not personal data. Secondly, I think that the strict requirements for consent to be free, that result, of course, in the fact that in a lot of cases, it's not possible to give a free consent. So that when a data subject wants to have control over the sharing of his data, of course, those requirements can raise an issue. And last thing I want to say here is that even the free provision of data that are received after having exercised the right of access, that's not always possible in practice. Why? Because the applicable legislation can impose some strict conditions. For instance, can limit the purposes for which the data can be reused, even after having obtained them through the right of access, or limit the purposes or limit the organizations with whom one can share those data.
Okay, very interesting. You already touched a bit the research, adoption research. Can you tell me a bit more about what the main findings of the research were that people really should take away?
Yeah, I think the main finding of the research is that there are three major data patterns for the exchange of the reuse of personal data in a solid ecosystem. You can so distinguish those three major patterns. Some of these patterns can take multiple forms, but in essence, you have three major patterns. Starting point for those patterns is always the finding that the data sharing occurs between two parties, between two controllers. On the one hand, we always have the source, that's the party that makes the data available. On the other hand, we have the recipient, which is the party that asks for the data and wants to reuse those data. First data pattern, that's the direct data exchange with consent. which just means the data is directly shared between source and recipient, provided the data subject consents to it. And important there is that the data subject gives the consent to the source, and that consent is logged or registered in some kind by the source. Second pattern, the indirect exchange with provision. That's a pattern that implies that the data are not directly exchanged, of course, between source and recipient, but indirectly through the data subject who exercises his or her right of access. And then after having obtained the data subject will provide the data to the recipient, to the organization, let's say, that wants to use the data. Third pattern, that's the direct exchange with feedback. There, in that pattern, the data are exchanged directly between source and recipient without any intervention of the data subject, which means that the data subject will merely be informed of the exchange, but has no control or say in it, and does not intervene in any way in this kind of exchange.
Okay, I think it's very interesting that we can structure the different sharing scenarios in those three major patterns, and also that consent is not always required. That's very interesting. Tom, can you explain a bit more about what these patterns are about?
Yeah, well, these patterns actually represent ways in which data can be shared between a source and a recipient, just like Dirk just said. And they also specify what the role of a data subject can be. But on the one hand, they're also kept a bit vague on purpose, so they are not really specific to Solid or any other technology. And on the other hand, we had to make them precise enough to explain or to be used to explain the legal considerations that are applicable when data is being reused.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got some very concrete results from the research. Dirk, can these patterns that were identified in the project help organizations in applying this framework for data sharing?
I think we are convinced that they can. The patterns can help organizations. Let's say that the patterns are designed to provide a kind of framework for the sharing of personal data. The application of those patterns is determined by legal considerations. Those considerations determine which of the patterns should be followed or applied, and the order in which the legal considerations are to be applied depends on the context, where we make, as you've already indicated, the distinction between B2B, B2G, G2G, and G2B. Those four contexts are relevant. For each context, we have elaborated a decision table of the relevant considerations. To make things applicable in practice, we have limited ourselves to 6 legal considerations, and I will perhaps take the time just to go over them rapidly. First consideration is the lawfulness of the processing by the recipient, which means that if the processing by the recipient is not lawful, the data may not be shared. This is very important because it's meant to verify what the recipient wants to do with the data, and of course, that is something that has to be acceptable, that has to be allowed, that has to be legitimate. Second consideration, the question whether there is a specific and applicable legal framework. If so, that framework can determine how the sharing of the data needs to be handled. This is one consideration that only applies to the case where the source is a public organization. To give an example, in Belgium, the sharing of data by an authority always requires a protocol to be concluded with the recipient, or if that's not possible, if parties do not find an understanding, then a deliberation of an authorization committee is needed. And what's important also is to indicate that sometimes the legal framework does not allow the exchange of data. It's, for instance, to give another example, not possible in Belgium for a future employer to directly consult the National Register of Criminal Records. So just to give a kind of indication. Third consideration, consent as a part of the legal framework, it is possible that the specific legal framework provides that the data sharing is only possible upon consent of the data subject. Example, that's the case for the sharing of some identification data in the National Register in Belgium in order to update the client data of a private organization. That sharing is only possible upon consent of the citizen, and of course it's needed that the citizen has a customer relationship with the private organization that wants to use the data for the updating of the client database.
Very
Fourth
interesting.
consideration, the compatibility of the purpose. If the legal framework does not exclude data sharing, then of course we have to apply the GDPR, and the GDPR requires us to verify whether the purpose of the exchange for the purpose of the sharing or the exchange is compatible with the original purpose, the purpose for which the data is originally collected. If that's the case, then data exchange is possible without the need for consent. To give an example, the sharing of data with regard to the wages by an employer with the authority that collects social contributions, that's compatible with the original purpose, the purpose of the collection of the data, which was to pay out the employee. So I think that's very clear. Fifth consideration, free consent. If there is no compatibility, sharing or exchanging the data is possible upon consent of the data subject. Of course, the consent has to be freely given. For instance, a data subject can give his or her consent to his employer to share the information on his or her paycheck with a bank or a financial institution in order to evaluate the application for a loan. Their consent is what will allow the exchange of the data. Last consideration, the free provision. If consent is not possible, for instance, because the consent cannot be given freely, the data subject can ask for the data by exercising his or her right of access and then provide those data to the recipient. Again, an example, the data subject can, for instance, ask the public agency for energy to provide him or her a copy of the energy related data of his house in order to again give those data to a bank or a financial institution who wants to evaluate an application for a loan. Let's say that we believe that the patterns, as we have distinguished them, can be useful for organizations to swiftly know whether it's possible to exchange or to obtain data, depending, of course, on the role that they have, and if so, what they have to do for that. By answering some simple questions and taking into account the context, they can know whether it's possible to share data or not. If so, whether the data subject has to intervene directly by giving consent or by, for instance, exercising his or her right of access and following that, provide the data to the recipient.
Okay, that's actually a very good explanation, and it helps to understand how DAPC can help organizations to decide what data can be shared under what circumstances. Thank you, very interesting. Tom, you have an example of a use case where this is already proving its worth?
Yeah, as I just explained, there's the use case of the social contribution, and apart from that, there are lots of cases in which people can reuse their data from one party at another. So, for example, you could reuse your income data from your taxes stored at the government to easily apply for a home loan at your bank. You could use the same data, so income data as well, to apply for life insurance. You could use your data that belongs to your for example, the house that you live in, the energy rating of your house, to easily apply for a home loan as well. So there are lots of use cases in which data can be reused uh, to allow for a better user experience.
Great, I can't wait. Tom, Dirk, thanks a lot for your contribution to the project, and thanks for your time today. For our next session, we're going to talk about the state of Solid with Ruben Verborgh, professor in semantic web and one of the key people behind Solid. Welcome, Ruben.
Hi, Lauro. Thanks for having me.
We're talking about Solid, and an ecosystem of solid personal pods means having different actors in the ecosystem. We're talking about pod providers, data browsers, applications, and Flanders is leading the way in the world, and you are one of the key people behind this movement. Can you tell me a bit more about how this vision is being implemented in Flanders today?
Well, of course, if you have a vision in which everybody has a personal data vault to start interacting with services, it is easy to fall into a chicken and egg trap, right? Where either there's no data vault, so the services wouldn't work, or nobody implements services because data vaults are not ready. So what we're trying to do here in Flanders is breaking through this potential chicken and egg situation. And the government has instigated a data utility company, which will help kickstart the ecosystem. So that way, we'll be sure that every citizen here in Flanders has a personal data vault. So that's, of course, just one piece of the puzzle. That said, it's not just technology, right? Especially not technology, I would say, even as a technologist myself. We also need to start looking at how business models will develop in the ecosystem, how different parties are situated opposite each other. And this is why we're also looking at use cases. So in collaboration with the Flemish government, but also other parties, we're talking, okay, how would this sector, this industry, how would they behave in an decentralized ecosystem where service providers no longer have to collect data themselves? So these are just some of the things that are running currently.
Yeah, sounds great. And we indeed see a lot of movement. And everything started with Solid as a universal standard for sharing and storing data. It's also in the process of becoming a W3C standard. How is that going?
Yeah, so standardization is obviously very important. Like the reason that we can view web pages on a laptop, a mobile device, a tablet, a phone, all of those things is because of standardization. And standards say, look, if you stick to those rules, then any other party can stick to the same rules, and then we can see each other's content. So essentially, we have to enable the same thing, but then for data, obviously, right? So every essential piece of data should be able to move around across systems, given permission of the user, of course, and then we'll be able to do things with it. So the standardization process is going pretty good in the sense that we're not starting from the bottom up. A lot of other projects with similar ideas regarding data vaults often want to reinvent the wheel. Whereas for us, it's a conscious choice to start from 30 years of web standards. We build on top of that. So many of the standards we use, in fact, already exist and have been approved over the past couple of years, sometimes even decades. And in particular, some of the data standards that we're using related to linked data, well, they also exist for a longer time, so we can build upon them. What we still need to add to all of the existing standards is the glue in between. Like there's quite some pieces that need to be connected, some agreements we need to have on top of that, and those, well, that's what we're working on a day-to-day basis, basically.
Okay. You've talked that technology is one piece of the puzzle. On the other hand, another piece of the puzzle is our business models. The Solid standard has multiple implementations, and they're all already becoming quite concrete. What can you tell me about that?
So that's the other important thing about standards. Like they only work if indeed there's multiple implementers. Simply said, on the web, we have multiple browsers. We can choose the device we browse the web with. We can choose a browser on that device to browse the web. So this choice is crucial to standards working well. And the same thing with Solid. So there are multiple implementations already, for instance, of Solid pods. Like just like there will be different providers, well, those providers can decide between different pieces of software on the one hand. On the other side is, of course, the applications, and they can reuse some of the same libraries, but ultimately there'll be different implementations using the same standards.
Okay, amazing. Ruben, perhaps a more general question: how do you see digital innovation experience evolve in the near future with everything of this in mind?
So the problem that we have today is we live in a data-driven economy. No, that's not a problem. Actually, that's a good thing. But in a data-driven economy, we have a problem that we need data, right? So the vision today that many companies have is, well, we need data to operate. Hence, we need to collect the data ourselves. Otherwise, nothing will happen. however, what we've seen is that leads to competition where different companies are more focused on obtaining data than they are on improving their service, offering a better service. And this is something that we can fix if indeed we give people control of their own data. And it seems to be a bit of a paradox, like, because if you hear control, then some companies start fearing, oh no, like, no, we're not going to be able to see anything anymore. And it was already super hard, but it's quite the contrary. So if you give people control, they can maintain their own data. And then any service they want to use and the service requires data, well, they can simply come with their own data vaults and then provide the data the service needs. So the responsibility for collecting and maintaining the data is no longer on the service provider, but we can give that to people, which means that service providers will be able to access data that they themselves have not necessarily written. And that becomes very interesting because then, if done right, there will be more data, not less. And then we'll see very interesting effects emerge. The difference being, of course, that the person decides what piece of the data they want to expose to what parties. As far as experience is concerned, well, people today have a suboptimal experience because any service they need to use, well, first they need to send their data there. So this is not going to be necessary anymore. Like, it will be much more seamless to use different services or to switch between different service providers. So if you are not satisfied with a provider and you try another one, no problem. Today, this would be a hassle because you would have to move all your data yourself. In the future, it will be much easier to choose and find the offering that is best for you. So we evolve to an ecosystem where the choice of service provider is no longer determined by data, and hence, service providers have different options to improve their service, and customers can choose a service that really matches their needs, not just a service that happens to already have some of their data.
Ruben, we've talked about multiple implementations of Solid. There are also multiple server implementations in the market. Can you give us some more insights on that topic?
Yes, exactly. So one side of standards is, of course, the server implementations there. And for instance, people in my team are working on a community server, which is a fully open source server that anybody can use for development, but also for small hosting. So all of those things are really possible. It's a quite flexible server. However, the priorities I have for this server are, for instance, different from enterprise servers. A company such as Inrupt is working on an enterprise server, which has a different mindset. It's closed source and it's meant for really large scale. But the good thing is that whatever application people develop, thanks to the standards, it will work on any of them. So you can start developing with one server, continue on the other, and it doesn't matter what kind of server people are actually using to put their data. As long as both servers follow the standards, then the same applications will work.
Yeah, this will indeed really convince people to adopt Solid, and the open source variant will stimulate organizations or just people to go ahead and start with it.
Yeah, I think it's possible and especially necessary, actually, to have open source implementations so anybody can see how it works and anybody can experiment with it. At the same time, the availability of enterprise software is also crucial for those enterprises who want to roll it out at scale. So standards give us choice, and it goes all the way from applications and service providers down to implementations.
Thanks a lot for your insights, Ruben. It was very interesting to hear it from your side. Now, let's talk about Digita and its contributions to the Solid ecosystem. I'd like to welcome Wouter Janssens, CEO of Digita. Hi, Wouter. What can you tell me about Digita?
Hi, Laura. Thanks for the introduction. Well, let's dive in right away. So, Digita, incorporated in 2018, we already have 2 years experience with Solid, and we're a technology-based company which provides services and products to help organizations get started with Solid. We raised over 900K already since the beginning of our incorporation, and we're expanding quite quickly. Our vision on personal data is as follows. People at this time already have personal data stored at many different organizations. For example, the government stores your home address, your bank stores your bank transactions, and your favorite social media platform stores your social media information. Now, in itself, that's not a problem. We still believe that the government is the right party to store your home address and that your bank will always manage your bank account information. Now, where we see the big difference or the big leap forward is when we start interconnecting and reusing data across these different organizations. So that when, for example, you create a bank account, you could reuse your existing home address, which is stored and managed by the government. That way, an organization like a bank does not have to store a duplicate of your home address. And when there is a change in your home address, the bank automatically gets notified. But also for the user, it's a lot easier because they don't have to provide all of that data. They can simply reuse data, which is already there. Now, to support that vision, we're currently looking at Solid. Solid allows you to provide a set of standards, which allows you to reshare and reuse data across different organizations and applications. Now, you could say if different organizations have different store information about a citizen, that might become a little bit difficult. How will it be easy for an end user, a citizen, to manage that information? Well, because Solid is based on open standards, which are similar to the open standards currently used in the email ecosystem, it's possible to build an application called a data browser, which will combine all of the information stored by those different organizations in one nice overview. And when a user has central access from that application across those different organizations, it's also possible to easily manage access control to that data. Now, Digita itself has a nice array of products which help organizations and citizens get started in the Solid ecosystem. First of all, for organizations, we have our Digita middleware and accelerator, which allows you to easily integrate your existing systems with the new Solid ecosystem and the data captured in Solid pods. On the other end, we also have the accelerator, which allows you to easily build proof of concepts of Solid applications compatible with the Solid ecosystem, so that you can easily get feedback from within your organizations, from clients or other stakeholders on these new developments. And secondly, we also have the Inox data browser. The data browser is an application aimed at end users, at citizens who want to see what happened to their data. So it allows you to, it's a web application, and it allows you to get an overview of all the events which have occurred with regards to your data. And it allows you to browse what data is stored across those different organizations and in those different Solid pods. Now I'm going to give you a small demo of the Digita platform and how it works in practice.
Thank you, Wouter, for this nice introduction to Digita. I'm looking forward to the demo.
Thanks, Lauro. So, as you can see on my screen right now, I've loaded the web interface of our platform, our middleware solution, which is currently connected to two of your existing systems, two SQL databases. The user information stored in those systems is currently synchronized by our middleware, and we're able to browse the data stored in those different systems. Even though they are completely different systems, I'm able to explore the data stored in them. So at this time, for example, my name and my loyalty points are stored across the loyalty database and the CRM database. Now, of course, no external data is used yet. I can, however, easily ask a certain user, myself in this case, for additional information, which might be necessary for business operations. To do so, our platform can easily generate invites. Invites so that the user can an invite to share data with your organization and with the Digita platform. I'll quickly show you how that works. As a user, as you can see now, there's a nice web interface which summarizes the contents of an invite. You first get a very detailed overview of the data you're going to share with a request to give your consent. and with the question, where do you want to share the data from? At this time, I have the possibility to either share my data from the Solid community pod server or from the InRub pod server. I already have a pod at inrub.net, so I'm going to reuse that information. I will now authenticate, and once the authentication is done, the information is shared back with the platform, but not just the data itself, the access tokens to my Solid pod. That way, the Digita platform can easily retrieve that information at any time it is required for business operations to have access to that data. When I go back to the overview I just shown you, and I refresh the screen, the new information will be present. And as you can see now, there is an additional source on the screen, the InRub pod server. When I go back to the overview of my data, you see there is a new name, which is shown in the overview, as well as an overview of the different events which have occurred to the data in my pod. Now, that being said, it's a nice overview of all of the data, but of course there's more to the Digita platform. It allows you, once you have connected several data sources, allows you to easily query that information. For example, I can request all of the names which have been stored and known by the platform, as you can see here in the response. The application itself allows you to connect to a lot of different sources. And to make that as easy as possible, we have a nice marketplace in which you can easily configure the different sources in your organization yourself through the user interface. So for example, the loyalty database we just connected, we can configure ourselves by providing the right credentials to access that database, as well as information on how the information in those databases should be transformed and normalized so it can be interpreted by the platform and other applications and reused as easily as possible. So this is a little introduction to the Digita platform. If you have any questions on that, please contact your Digita representative for more information. Thank you.
There you have it. That wraps it all. Thank you for following the first episode of Digita's podcast, and see you next time.